thrilled to bring to the broadcast for the first time David French. David is a staff writer at National Review. He's an attorney. For years was a senior leader in the Alliance Defending Freedom. He's a veteran of Operation Iraqi Freedom, author or co-author of several books, including most recently the number one New York Times best-selling Rise of ISIS. And you may have heard his name in recent weeks because he was put forward as a potential presidential candidate as an alternative to Donald Trump. And that brought a lot of attention to David French and his family. And after reflecting on it, he felt it was not the thing for him to do. But David, I would have voted for you, just to let you know that. This is David French. Welcome to the Line of Fire for the first time.
Well, thanks so much for having me, and I appreciate your vote of confidence.
Yeah. So you would have had one vote anyway. In all seriousness, though, and I would have voted actually for you, but I read a ton of stuff online constantly just because of my own writing and my own interest in the radio show. But as I've been reading you regularly on National Review, you've become my favorite online columnist. So many things you're addressing, I also address, especially with the moral and cultural issues. And I love the way you address them, the clarity with which you address them, and the consistency with which you do. So really thank you for the hard work. I know it goes into doing this, as I write 3 to 5 columns a week as well. So thank you for the efforts to do this.
Well, thanks very much. It's a privilege to write for National Review, and unfortunately, it's kind of a sad time to be writing. I mean, our nation faces an extraordinary political crisis, and we're going through an extraordinary moral crisis as well.
Yeah, we absolutely are. Not without hope, but with urgency for sure. Hey, before we get your perspective on the European Union and on Britain's exit, just a few things that I know are themes you touch on all the time. Number one, are you still never Trump? And if so, why?
Yes, I am never Trump. And how much time do we have for the reasons? No, let me just put it this way. I think essentially what's happened is that the presumptive nominees of both major parties are, we've ended up nominating essentially a Democrat as the GOP nominee, and a corrupt and dishonest Democrat at that. I mean, one of the things that I think is most painful about the Trump phenomenon is it's not just that he's completely ignorant of foreign affairs, economic affairs. It's not just that he's flipped all over the place on all of his positions. I mean, he's for one thing one day, against it the next. It's not that he doesn't understand the value of our foreign alliances and doesn't have the slightest understanding of the real and true threats of jihad and what's required to confront it. It's also that he's just so fundamentally dishonest all the time. And I believe that the act of advocating for him and for a person of that low character is going to have a negative effect, particularly on the Christian community. They're going to be finding themselves consistently in the position of defending the indefensible. For example, saying, yes, I know that what he's saying is racist and fomenting an enormous amount of racial division in this country, but vote for him anyway. Yes, I know that he treats women horribly, mocks the disabled, but vote for him anyway. I think that has a terrible effect on people. I understand that there are those who are going to go into a voting booth and they're going to look at the choice between Hillary and Trump and maybe a Gary Johnson and just hold their nose and vote for Trump. I get that. I understand it. But what I don't understand is the notion and the act of using whatever God-given gifts and talents we have to advocate for that man, to advocate for him becoming leader of the free world. I can't get there in any way, shape, or form.
And in one of your articles, you reflected on the role of the church, and you explained, my words, my paraphrase, it was not primarily to form a coalition behind a particular candidate, but rather to be the church in society. So even if a Hillary came in and appointed the worst Supreme Court justices, that doesn't stop us from doing what we're supposed to do, nor does it obligate us to back another candidate if we have issues in conscience with that.
Yes, the moral witness of the church shouldn't be sacrificed for the chance that the chance that Trump might appoint one or two better Supreme Court justices. The moral witness of the church is far more important than that. And I must say that I'm a little bit mystified by this fixation on one or two justices of the Supreme Court. The court is already pretty terrible, as we've seen just in this past week.
Yes.
But the notion that you can fixate on the chance, because we don't actually know what Trump will do. The only thing that we know Trump will do is he will do what he believes is best in his own self-interest. That's the only thing that we know he'll do. So we don't know exactly what that Supreme Court will look like, but we do know he doesn't know anything, and in fact has incredibly destructive ideas in a wide variety of other arenas that are extraordinarily important. I mean, in the foreign policy arena alone, his seemingly willingness to discard and toss aside alliances that have kept the larger peace in the world for more than 70 years could be one of the most destructive acts of any American president in the history of the country. And yet we just sort of dismiss that as if it's barely relevant because maybe he might select one or two decent Supreme Court justices, or the fact that he is so ignorant about the economy and so aggressively silly about it that he could absolutely wreck our national economy, sending struggling middle-class families and poor families into worse economic conditions. But that's okay because maybe he might appoint one or two Supreme Court justices. When you look on balance, it doesn't make any sense at all.
Yeah. Who appointed Justice Kennedy?
Reagan.
Right. So if we think that he's the swing vote on the horrific redefinition of marriage decision, and that now he swung for the first time on the abortion side with this ridiculous ruling a few days back as well, that raises questions. By the way, my Facebook page, we're approaching 400,000 fans, but you can't easily do a survey there that's immediately tallied, so I do them mainly on Twitter. So it's only a smaller sampling. We've got like 21,500 Twitter followers. But I posted yesterday, my views on voting for Trump are, and I gave 4 choices: still for Trump, still never Trump, from against to for, and from against to maybe. So there were 21% still for Trump. There were 9% who've gone from against to for. There are 20% who've gone from against to maybe. But there are 50% say still never Trump. So obviously it doesn't bode well. Again, it's just my little cross-section here. But that doesn't bode well for him in terms of the coming election. But again, we continue to pray for God's best and recognize the role of the church remains the same. All right, one last question for you, and then we'll switch over to Brexit. We've got about a minute and a half for this one. I still use the term radical Islam for the standard reasons, but you recently wrote why you don't use that term anymore. What's that?
Yeah, I tend to use the term jihadist because it is actually describing what the theology is, the theology of this holy war. And also, I sometimes am uncomfortable with the term radical Islam because it would imply that their beliefs are necessarily radical within the Muslim world. I think in entire nations and entire regions, the jihadist worldview isn't radical at all. It's quite mainstream. And so we're often, when we talk about radical Islam, I think inadvertently perhaps minimizing or diminishing the actual level of the threat. We have a threat from jihadists. Those jihadists are quite mainstream in many Muslim communities around the world, and they're viciously deadly, as jihadists have always been throughout history. So I tend to use that term because I think it's more accurate, and because I think that jihadist Islam is more mainstream than people realize and more mainstream than people hope.
Got it. All clear. All right, friends, we come back. I'll speak with attorney David French about the significance of Britain's leaving the European Union, implications for America as well. You can read his writings on a regular basis, as I do, at nationalreview.com, or you can get his best-selling book, On the Rise of ISIS, at any of your bookstores or online book dealers. We'll be right back.
It was devised to make sure that the great mass of the people could not control government ever again.
Janet Daly speaking about Brexit, speaking about the vote, and speaking about the larger implications of this. Michael Brown just got back from Australia last night. Delighted to be with you today, speaking with attorney and author David French. David, I had just not followed the Brexit situation that closely, and I thought the vote was going to turn out the way it did for some reason, even though polls were expecting the opposite. First, why do you think the vote went the way it did? And secondly, why is this having such worldwide implications? Or maybe the media is blowing it up, but what's going on?
Well, at first, you can't look at this vote and think of it in terms of short-term trends. The reality is that Great Britain has always had an uneasy relationship with the European continent. And the precise role of Great Britain in that continent has been fought over, sometimes literally, for centuries. And so, Britain was hardly all in on the EU to begin with. It kept the pound, for example, and didn't adopt the euro. And so this vote is a product both of short-term trends, but also this long-term uneasiness. And so essentially what the British people did is they said that they wanted, and the exit pollsters showed that this was the case, both on the more liberal and the more conservative voters who voted to leave, that they wanted decisions that implicated the UK to be made by the voters of the UK. They didn't want to delegate their sovereignty to this multinational organization. In other words, they essentially reclaimed independence, granting themselves the same power to govern themselves that Americans have and take for granted. So that's what they did. It shouldn't be all that surprising that the people of Britain would choose this. But I think one of the reasons why there has been such an unbelievable, hysterical reaction is that this cuts against this notion, this progressive notion of history that says that history has a side and it has its own momentum, and that momentum is moving away from nation states. It's moving away from sort of nationalism or patriotism and moving towards this more globalized governmental system where you have multinational government organizations. Direct democracy is vanishing, more in favor of rule by international technocratic elite. And so this progressive notion of history is being, in the last 5 years or so, is just taking body blow after body blow. And the Brexit decision is just the latest blow against this notion of history. And if you're a progressive, you've staked an awful lot on this idea that history has a side. And what the Brexit vote does is it kind of casts your entire argument into real doubt.
So what are the implications then for America?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question. I do think there are some common threads on both sides of the Atlantic where people are getting fed up with the regulatory superstate rule by unelected bureaucrats, fed up with the international and domestic elite that, truth be told, isn't all that elite to begin with. But that's going to manifest itself in very different ways depending on each country. In Brexit, the way it manifested in England is very much in keeping with English history, with British history, and very much in keeping with British unease with the continent more generally. Here in the U.S., of course, we have a different history. We have different challenges, but we do have problems with a regulatory superstate. We do have problems with a technocratic elite that's done a pretty good job of putting together a system that works well for them and not as much for everybody else. But you know what? As with every time there's a revolution, whether it's a political revolution or armed revolution, it's the responsibility of the revolutionaries to put together something better than what they overthrew. So this is only half the battle in Brexit. Now it's time for a responsible leadership to extricate England from the EU, and responsible leadership going forward. Unfortunately, here in the U.S., a lot of our sort of revolutionary mindset, both through the Sanders and Trump campaign, is answering this failing establishment with failure candidates. So you don't. It's almost to pick your poison. Do you go with a failed elite, or do you go with a failure of a candidate?
So if we just focus a couple more minutes on America. And obviously, you focused on this to the point that you were put forth as a potential presidential candidate. So these are issues you've reflected on deeply. Our mutual friend, Attorney Joe Franco, and I have discussed for years now issues having to do with LGBT activism and the implications thereof. But as conservative leaders, as well as lovers of people and individuals, as you're looking ahead and this whole myth of the progressive view of history, is there a sense of inevitability that there's no way America can turn back from where it's going, or there has to be a major crash first, that's what, quote, history teaches us, or this is the way things are progressing? Or do you say, okay, it's a dire situation, but absolutely change can come?
Well, you know, the only thing that's inevitable in history is Christ's ultimate victory.
Right.
You know, any given cultural or historical trend until Christ's victory, ultimate victory, is temporary, is transient. It's not inevitable. You know, our nation has gone through multiple waves where it's drifted away from God, then it's come back to the Lord. I mean, you know, you don't call something a great awakening unless people were slumbering before the awakening, right?
Yep.
So to describe any sort of historical trend as inevitable, irresistible, is fundamentally wrong. And in fact, if you dig down into the numbers, you will see that America is becoming more secular, yes, but it's also becoming more religious. So the secular population is growing and the evangelical population is growing. And those people who are more nominal believers are tending to fall by the wayside. So what that means, the actual trend is not necessarily as much towards secularization, although that's certainly happening in some parts of the country, but towards more polarization. So I think we will see polarization and division before we will see ultimate triumph, say, of the secular progressive point of view.
Right. And by the way, I don't know if you've read Rodney Stark's book, The Triumph of Faith, but he really does dispel the myth of just the complete secularism of society, or even in Europe. And what he indicates is the old Chesterton adage that when people don't believe in God, it's not they believe in nothing, that they believe in anything. So,
right.
You'll have like a higher percentage of atheists who believe in UFOs or things like that. So the void gets filled one way or another. But David, thanks for being there on the front lines. Keep up the good work. I don't think Jonah Goldberg knows me personally, but tell him I said hi, all right?
I will.
Thanks so much, sir.
Thanks for having me.